Hello, I'm Joshua Unruh, your superhero scholar. Welcome to Superhero University on Captain Marvel, Earth's Mightiest Hero. Have a seat. Class is now in session. Welcome back to a long-awaited Superhero University. I am so excited to be finally talking to you about Captain Marvel in the run-up to her foray into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Truth be told, this was requested of me months ago, but I had a very difficult time getting it done. In addition to my own travel schedule and some medical issues, Carol herself is a very complex character with a rich and varied history. And unlike some of the other characters and issues that I've covered in Superhero University, I'm only familiar with bits and pieces of hers. Add to the fact that so little of her comics origin works at all in the MCU, and I was left a bit paralyzed as to how to cover her. Carol deserves everything, but everything is a lot, and it's impossible to know what will be important for her movie. In the end, I decided to dive into the first collected edition of Captain Marvel, Earth's Mightiest Hero. It's written by Kelly Sue DeConnick, and the illustrators are Dexter Soy, Emma Rios, Felipe Andrade, and David Lopez. Ms. DeConnick has redefined Carol not once, but twice, and I think both redefinitions will be reflected in the film, albeit through a glass darkly. Her comic book origins don't mesh very well with what we have of the MCU, but you'll see what I mean as we delve into who Carol is and how she came to be. As always, we'll take it page by page, and sometimes panel by panel, delving into deeper issues of history and identity as we go. So let's get to issue number 1. Issue number 1 begins with a fight, but it also begins with a conversation, both of which will, in their own way, define this soft reboot of Captain Marvel. So when it comes to the fight, let's take a look at who we're fighting against. Our enemy here is Crusher Creel, the Absorbing Man. Any of you who listen to my MCU podcast, Listen Up A-Holes, are familiar with Crusher. He's appeared in name on Daredevil and in person on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. The comic book version of Crusher Creel drank a magical elixir created by Loki, which gave him the power to take on the properties of anything he touched. This transformation extends to the clothing and the prisoner's ball and chain he wore when he drank the potion. So, Crusher can take on the physical properties of solids, liquids, gases, and even energy. If he touches something large enough, like a building, he can absorb enough mass to duplicate the growth powers of someone like Giant Man. He's intensely dangerous and insanely powerful. But thankfully, he's also dumb as a rock. Or in the case of this fight, a moon rock, as he is convinced that touching a rock from the moon will give him moon powers. I have bad news for you, Crusher. You need an actual moon crystal for that, and there's only one, and it's in Japan, and Usagi isn't sharing. Now, for the purposes of this fight, Crusher is also the voice of toxic masculinity. He is dismissive and condescending to Carol. He refers to her as Captain America's secretary and as Mrs. Marvel, and a few other things besides, like Broad and Little Missus, and he even denigrates Captain America for taking orders from a woman. But let's take a step back here for a moment and talk about him calling her Mrs. Marvel. Carol has had a lot of code names. She wasn't the first, or even second, or even third Captain Marvel in the 616, and she certainly didn't start out as one. We'll get into the other Captains Marvel as we go, but for now, focus on the fact that Carol started as Ms. Marvel. Ms. Marvel is her first heroic identity and was actually meant to be extremely feminist and progressive in 1977. At the time, Ms. was being used by women who didn't want to be denigrated as Miss and didn't plan on or need a man's name to be self-actualized, therefore dismissing ever being a Mrs. Since the original Captain Marvel was still active at the time, that name just wasn't available to Carol when she debuted. And frankly, even from the men writing her and trying to say something with the use of Ms. in her name Ms. Marvel, allowing her, on her own merits, to be Captain Marvel would probably still have been unthinkable. So, although the name hasn't aged well at all, Ms. Marvel, on its own, very much meant to tell the tale of a powerful woman stepping out on her own as a hero and not needing a man's validation. At the beginning of this story, her costume is brand new, but she is again operating under the name Ms. Marvel. Ms. Marvel began as a flying brick. Now, this isn't name-calling, it's a type of character in superhero comics. You know, super strong, indestructible, can fly. But you'll notice here she's shooting energy beams at Creel. So, towards the end of her first run as Ms. Marvel, Carol was in a very questionable story that effectively, and I think without the writer realizing it or even thinking twice about it, made Carol into a rape victim and the mother of her rapist's child who grew up to be her rapist. Time travel and cosmic nonsense cannot stop male writers from using rape as a plot point, apparently. After her return from this, the X-Man Rogue permanently absorbed Carol's powers and memories. Professor X used his telepathy to return her memories, which led to a textual exchange where Carol was able to rightfully accuse the Avengers of not noticing her brainwashing and allowing her subsequent rape. It was the X-Men creator, Chris Claremont, doing his best to make up for someone else's very bad story. But to return to the energy blasts. As Carol worked with the X-Men, she went to space, and the Brood, an alien race, similar to but legally distinct from the xenomorphs from the Alien films, experimented on her and gave her the ability to tap into the energy of a white hole. She used these powers under the name Binary. And these powers were mainly the absorption and redirecting of energy. Later on in this issue, you will see her absorb quite a lot of heat, and you'll see her shoot lasers and glow and all that good stuff. All of that is left over from her Binary days. Now, Carol has had other code names, but we will get to them as they come. Knowing that she's going to wind up calling herself Captain Marvel, this is an interesting opportunity to discuss rank, since both Carol and Captain America bring it up. Carol's past is in the United States Air Force. And let's remember, this is a relaunch of a character with a confusing and sometimes circuitous history. But Ms. DeConnick wants to zero in on Carol as pilot, so it's a good excuse to either remind people of that history in the Air Force, or to tell new readers that it exists at all. For fun though, let's discuss Captain America's assertion that Carol outranks him. She agrees, because she retired a full bird colonel. But a fun fact that's often forgotten in the 616 is that Captain America is a captain in name only. Steve Rogers never rose above the rank of Private First Class in this man's army. Which seems smart, because everyone deferred to him in the field anyway, and the American Army definitely doesn't seem like the kind of organization that would give command rank to its living weapons. But notice something else about Carol and Captain America's interactions here. Carol thinks tactically. Even after being hit in the face with a marble column, she orders Cap to save people behind him. She's aware of the entire battlefield at all times, to the point that Captain America takes orders from her. Now, that part's not weird for Cap. He respects ability, not rank, gender, or anything else. But it's rare that someone is better at maintaining field awareness than he is. But it's also this tactical thinking that allows Carol to come up with a plan that will defeat Creel with as little physical altercation as possible. She goes around his power to beat him by basically choking him out. That's smart. Now, after the fight, we have a reporter thinking that Ms. Marvel is a new hero rather than just wearing a new suit, and it gives Cap an idea. He suggests that she should be Captain Marvel. Now's probably the time when I should talk a little bit about the first Captain Marvel. His real name was Mar-Vell. He was a Kree who came to Earth in disguise to help protect humanity from the Kree Empire. Now, I could go on a massive digression about the Kree, and we may need to talk about them more later. For now, just know that they are one of the major interstellar superpowers in the Marvel 616 universe, along with some, from the X-Men books like the Shi'ar and the Skrulls from the Fantastic Four books, and also the Brood, who we mentioned before. So Mar-Vell is operating on Earth in disguise as a human being to help shield us from the influence of the Kree Empire. While he's in disguise, he and Carol become romantically linked, and after an explosion of a Kree weapon, which we will talk more about later, he shielded Carol's body with his own. This transferred some of his genetic code to her, making her a Kree-human hybrid and giving her the flying brick powers that she'd use as Ms. Marvel. Now, as you can imagine, in a relationship that spans the better part of 25 or 30 years, the relationship between Carol and Mar-Vell was complicated. But, largely, Carol loved him. And clearly, she still has strong feelings about him and his memory. I say his memory because the character Mar-Vell, that version of Captain Marvel, died from cancer in the early 80s. That's the publishing history 1980s, not the internal chronology of superheroes, which is on an ever-sliding scale, but is centered on an eternal now or just before now. But that said, Captain America's point is good. Captain Marvel wasn't Mar-Vell's name. It was his mantle, and now his legacy. I am a big fan of the concept of legacy heroes in general. I talked a lot about that, and will talk even more about that in my Batman sessions of Superhero University. But this is a particularly worthwhile argument in this context, because while there have been other Captains Marvel, some have just used the name, while others tried to pick up Mar-Vell's mantle, but none of them ever tried to live up to his legacy. Carol is the only one who would even care enough to try, and Mar-Vell always loved Carol and would actually trust her to do it. And you can tell in this scene that she's really thinking hard about it too. She's deep enough in her emotions and her thoughts to break the cutting board with a knife. But she's also deflecting with humor. She uses Cap being old-fashioned about the name Ms. Marvel to get out of the conversation, which is got a little bit of meta humor to it, as Ms. Marvel is pretty old-fashioned in its own way too. In the end, Captain America shows what a brilliant judge of character he is. He says, "You've led the Avengers. You've saved the world. Quit being adjunct. Take the mantle. Unless you think you can't handle it." This is the point when Carol realizes that she's being manipulated a little bit. She asks, "Did you just dare me?" And Captain America's response is, "You're Air Force. It always works." It's fun to play with Cap's military background in the Army. It rarely comes up, and it even more rarely comes up in terms of a friendly rivalry between two different forces in the armed services. Army and Air Force have, usually, a friendly rivalry, and I like seeing that reflected here in Captain America and the soon-to-be Captain Marvel, especially since Ms. DeConnick is making Carol's background in the Air Force such a prominent part of this reiteration of the character. Now, enter Spider-Man. For those of you who don't keep up with monthly comics, Spider-Man was an Avenger at this time. He also tells Cap to tell the president to tell Michelle he said, "Sup?" I'm just going to wistfully say, those were the days, friends. Now, I like this interaction between Spider-Man and Captain Marvel because Spidey fills a unique space. He's been doing the superhero thing longer than literally anyone in the 616, even longer than Cap if you adjust for how long Steve was in the ice. But since he's usually solo, he doesn't carry the weight in the world that Steve or Carol does. He's the single most qualified Avenger with the least seniority. He's usually one of the more powerful people in the room, too. Think of the suite of spider powers he usually gets. Super strength, super agility, a precognitive sixth sense that warns him of danger. He is a very powerful individual, and like I say, stands head and shoulders above most groups of Avengers. But next to Carol, she'd vaporize him. He's both deferential and self-deprecating, which also usually happens in the best depictions of Peter. But in this case, it is legit. But he's also a joker. He brings up her hair, then thinks better of the joke, and he does the same thing when asked about the name Ms. Marvel. In the end, he's no help to her. Not really. He's the one and only Spider-Man, at least at the time that this was published anyway, and he can't speak to mantles or to legacies. Here the issue transitions from fight to flight. It is right that Carol is in her first full flight of the issue when we are introduced to her mentor as a pilot, Helen Cobb. Helen will be incredibly important to this first arc, both spiritually and as a character in her own right. So it is good that she's interesting right off the bat, and a great contrast to Carol. In the same way that we take note of who Captain America takes orders from, let's take note of the pilot that Carol envies. We get a very brief overview of the origin of Carol's powers, but in this case, rather than empowering her, she talks about them as though they're taking her out of the competition for piloting speed records that are clearly very important to her. She loves being who she is. She loves doing what she can do, but both also make it impossible for her to compete in the only way that she's understood competition for the majority of her life. In a real way, she's utterly surpassed her hero, and in another way, she's not even allowed to try and compete with her hero. We're first introduced to Carol's new helmet in this moment also, which is modeled after Kree helmets. She's never really been Kree, but she can't deny the connection that she has to the Empire, even if it's only through Mar-Vell and some of her villains. I think it's really great that she's basically given a flight helmet. She's still a pilot, even if she's flying under her own power. And the fact that her flight helmet nods towards her connection to the Kree Empire is just icing on the cake. I am a big believer in superhero costumes telling you a great deal about the character just by looking at them. And with Carol's very traditional red, blue, and yellow color scheme and the very prominent chest emblem, you are told that she is very much in the Superman mold, at least in as much as she's here to help and she is incredibly powerful. In fact, I think the sash that she wears is both a nod to some of her previous costumed identities and also does some of the job that a cape would do in an even more traditional superhero costume. And when you take that very basic, in many ways, very evocative, very iconic superhero costume and put a Kree helmet on top of it, you are telling me something fundamental and interesting about the character's origin, and I love that. We're also introduced to Carol's status as something of an adrenaline junkie. She's always been first into a fight. That's been part of her character for a long time now. But now we're positioning that as someone who appreciates the risk of doing dangerous things and setting new records. That's not totally different from all past characterizations, but it's a smart refinement. But no other risk matters to Carol like the one of a pilot in her plane going ludicrously fast. Helen damn sure wouldn't stare into the face of eternity and think about what she'd lost. Helen would punch holes in the sky. I'm taking the damn name. Stated on a full-page spread of Carol in her element, fully costumed as Captain Marvel and with the backdrop of the sky. Even when she's so high, it isn't even the sky anymore. Now we take a big gear shift in the story as we transition to the Upper West Side, and we meet Tracy Burke. Tracy Burke first appeared in Ms. Marvel number 8 back in 1977. Tracy is a supporting character from Carol's civilian life during those Ms. Marvel days. Carol ran a magazine called Woman Magazine, which was owned by J. Jonah Jameson, publisher of the Daily Bugle and famous, or infamous, hater of Spider-Man. Keeping in mind that Ms. Marvel was a consciously progressive choice as a moniker and a title for the comic book, Carol became a writer and eventually the editor-in-chief of Woman Magazine, which was the 616's answer to Ms. Magazine. Carol convinced retired journalist Tracy Burke to come back to the journalism business, working for Carol at Woman. Together, they published Women's Lib-style articles and fought against Jameson's insistence that they only do fashion and diet pieces. Tracy and Carol became close friends over that time, even as there was friction in their relationship, because Tracy often had to run the magazine while Carol was off doing Ms. Marvel things. Tracy is a lesbian who had a long-time in-panel relationship with Theodosia Teddy Matthews, until Teddy Matthews herself passed away. At the time of this story, Tracy is battling cancer with intensive chemotherapy treatments. She's still clearly tough as nails and takes no guff off anybody, not least of which her ex-boss turned Avenger, Carol Danvers. Now, I really enjoy the intergenerational interplay between these two very different breeds of tough broad. The unspoken but intense love between them comes through every moment on the page. And you see it in Carol playing a nurturing role that she doesn't typically play, as well as Tracy allowing herself to be nurtured in ways that she isn't entirely comfortable with. This relationship is great, and we will see a lot more of it over the course of Earth's Mightiest Hero. The newspaper is a handy transition to the next and final movement of our story. Tracy sees something upsetting, and at first, we're meant to think that it's the name change. That headline is pretty terrible. New Captain Marvel, and he is a she. Yikes. But that's not what caught Tracy's attention. What Tracy saw is the announcement that Helen Cobb has passed away. This moves us into the flashback to the Whiskey Tenors Flyers Club. First of all, note the initials, WTF, an old military term, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot or Whiskey Tenor Flyers. The captions here are obviously not in Carol's voice. You can tell this in the way it sounds, but also in the typographical choices. It looks typographically different than the interiority that we were given with Carol's caption boxes earlier in the issue. We will quickly come to realize that this is Helen Cobb writing to Carol in the present, but it overlays nicely with the 20 years previous flashback. Also, by the end, we will see that this is something Carol is sharing at Helen's funeral. Now, the flashback is the first time that I noticed how well Dexter Soy reflects Carol's different personas in her posture, in the way that she physically carries herself. During the fight with Creel, she was upright and in charge. Immediately after, when Captain America spoke to the press, she was calmer, more demure, and shying away from that public attention. When she's flying, her head and shoulders are thrown back and fists are clenched. She's pouring on the speed with her body language. While speaking with Cap, she's contemplative and maybe a little beleaguered at the idea of taking on the name Captain Marvel. With Tracy, she's actually relaxed. In the flashback, she begins shy. And this is the first time that we've ever seen Carol as a wilting flower. Certainly she was avoiding the public spotlight after the fight with Creel, but this is her actively seeking to not be noticed. So that should tell you that she is in the presence of what, to her at least, is greatness. However, by the end of the conversation, she's standing straighter. She's challenging Helen. This is masterful storytelling in the illustration. We are getting so many character beats with nothing but the posture of our main character. Here, Carol mentions the Mercury 13, which was a real group of women. Taken from Wikipedia, the Mercury 13 refers to 13 American women who, as part of a privately funded program, underwent the same physiological screening tests as the astronauts selected by NASA on April 9, 1959 for Project Mercury. The term was coined in 1959 by Hollywood producer James Cross as a comparison to the Mercury 7 given to the selected male astronauts. However, the Mercury 13 were not part of NASA's astronaut program, never flew in space, and never met as a group. Now, while Helen Cobb is fictional, Geraldine Jerrie Cobb was a real member of the Mercury 13, and I'm proud to say, a fellow Oklahoman. Now, I'm no expert on the Mercury 13 or Jerrie Cobb, despite our connection to the Sooner State. So check the show notes for links that will explain more about them. Note here between Helen and Carol, there is more intergenerational friction. Helen and the rest of the 13 were just as capable as Carol. But Carol's generation was the first to get the chances that Helen wanted so badly. There's a combination of mutual admiration and also mutual antagonism between these two women over all these facts. And we will see that play out in extremely surprising ways throughout this first volume. We transition from the first meeting between Carol and Helen to their last, as Carol is taking part in Helen's funeral, and she flies up to scatter Helen's ashes into space, where Helen always wanted to go, but was never allowed. And on a final page showing Captain Marvel in all her power and all her glory, once again against the backdrop of a sky so high it isn't even the sky anymore, Helen's words say it all. Death and indignity be damned. We'll get there, and we'll be the stars we were always meant to be. Now, here's the confession moment. I'm a big Captain Marvel fan now, but I wasn't always. I've often enjoyed Carol, especially as binary since I was a big X-Men fan back in the day, but I never really saw her as having this preeminent space in the Marvel Universe. In fact, I don't think many did, including most of the people that wrote her. But Kelly Sue DeConnick saw that potential, the potential for Carol to fill an iconic space in the same way that characters like Superman or Wonder Woman do. Ms. DeConnick set out to show the rest of us her vision right here in this very first issue, and I think we can declare it an unmitigated success. Since this issue, Carol has stepped into a huge leading role in the Marvel Universe, and in just 1 month is set to hit the big screen as Marvel's first woman-led film starring Brie Larson. And the movie owes much of its look, feel, and themes to Ms. DeConnick's work. By the look of the trailers and the fan reactions, it will in fact punch holes in the sky. And that brings us to the end of this first session of Superhero University on Captain Marvel, Earth's Mightiest Hero. If you have any questions or input, you can find me easily enough on Twitter at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is SHUMarvel or Superhero University. Please remember that Superhero University is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Thank you again for joining me this session of Superhero University, and we'll see you back here for the next part of Captain Marvel, Earth's Mightiest Hero. Until then, class is dismissed.